That woman's husband belongs to me now, and everyone in this room knows it." Chloe Carter said it into a live microphone, stone cold, smiling, standing in the middle of a 600-person black tie gala with a champagne glass raised toward Victoria Whitmore like a weapon. She didn't whisper it. She didn't hint at it. She announced it sharp, deliberate, loud enough to bounce off every chandelier in that ballroom. Then she laughed, drained her glass, and looked straight at Victoria, waiting for tears, waiting for collapse, waiting for the wife to break. Victoria didn't blink, because Chloe Carter had just made the most catastrophic mistake of her entire life, and she was the only person in that room who didn't know it yet. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your whole story, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this story is just getting started. Victoria Whitmore had known about the affair for 112 days. She hadn't stumbled across a text message. She hadn't hired a private investigator. She hadn't cried into a pillow or confronted her husband in the kitchen at midnight with shaking hands and a broken voice. She had simply paid attention. And attention, when applied by a woman like Victoria Whitmore, was a far more dangerous instrument than any private investigator money could buy. She noticed the small things first. The way Daniel's shirt smelled different, not like another woman's perfume, not yet, but like the particular combination of someone who had freshly showered before coming home. The way his phone, which had once lived face up on the kitchen counter, like it had nothing to hide, now traveled everywhere with him. Face down password changed to something she had never been told. The way he laughed differently on certain phone calls, lighter, younger, almost unrecognizable, before stepping outside onto the terrace and pulling the glass door shut behind him. She noticed. She catalogued. She said nothing. Because Victoria Whitmore did not come from a family that screamed. She came from a family that watched. And then when the moment was exactly right, they moved. The night of the Fairmont Royal York Gala began the way every major social event in their world began, with preparation that took hours and was designed to look effortless. Victoria sat in front of her vanity mirror at 5 in the afternoon, watching her reflection as her stylist worked. She wore no expression in particular, just the calm, focused face of a woman thinking through something no one else in the room was equipped to understand. Her personal assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, appeared in the doorway holding a tablet. "The car is confirmed for 7:30. Your table is front and center. Daniel already called ahead to confirm your seats. And—" Priya paused for exactly half a second. "Chloe Carter is also on the guest list tonight, under the Hayes Dynamics corporate sponsorship block." The stylist's hands continued moving through Victoria's hair. Victoria's expression did not change by a single millimeter. "I see," she said. "Do you want me to—" "No." Victoria met Priya's eyes in the mirror. "Leave it exactly as it is." Priya gave one careful nod and disappeared back into the hallway. She had worked for Victoria for 3 years. She had learned early that when Victoria said leave it, she did not mean ignore it. She meant she had already handled it in ways that didn't require anyone else's involvement. Victoria looked back at her own reflection. She thought about Daniel. About the man she had married 12 years ago in a ceremony at her parents' estate in Connecticut, a ceremony her father Augustus had organized with the meticulous precision he applied to every significant event in the Whitmore family history. She thought about what Daniel had looked like then, 32 years old, brilliant in a scrappy, hungry way that had genuinely attracted her, full of ideas and ambition and a charm that felt real because it was backed by genuine intelligence. She had loved him. She wanted that to be clear, at least to herself, sitting alone in that room with the stylist's hands moving through her hair and the city beyond the window preparing itself for evening. She had loved him. This was not a woman who had married for strategy and was now executing an exit. This was a woman who had loved a man, watched him change in ways she couldn't control, and was now doing what her family had always taught her to do when love was no longer enough to hold a situation together. You protect what matters. You protect it quietly, and then you rebuild. Daniel had been in the adjoining room getting dressed. She could hear him moving around, hear the low murmur of his voice on the phone, that lighter, younger laugh again, brief, quickly suppressed when he remembered where he was. She had heard it and felt the familiar twin sensation, a small, dull ache in her chest, and underneath that something colder and more focused. He emerged from the adjoining room at 6:45 looking handsome in a way that had once made her genuinely proud. Dark suit, silver tie hair touched with just enough gray at the temples to make him look distinguished rather than old. He was 51, and he looked 45, and he knew it. "You look beautiful," he said. And the terrible thing was that she believed he meant it. Even men who were lying about everything else sometimes told the truth about the small things. "Thank you," she said, ready for another evening of saving the world one charity donation at a time. He smiled his CEO smile, the one designed for rooms, not for her specifically. "Ready?" she said simply. The car ride to the Fairmont was 22 minutes. They sat beside each other in the back of the town car and made the kind of light, competent conversation that long-married people who no longer said anything real to each other had perfected to an art form. The gala, the guest list, the foundation that was being honored tonight. Daniel mentioned 2 board members he needed to connect with. Victoria mentioned a philanthropist she'd been corresponding with about a joint initiative. Professional, smooth, entirely hollow. She watched the city pass outside her window and thought about her brother Julian's call from 3 days ago. Julian, who was 3 years younger, and who had inherited their father's legal mind and their mother Eleanor's particular brand of devastating social intelligence. "We're ready," Julian had said without preamble, without even saying hello first. "Dad signed off. Everything is in position. We just need you to give us the signal." "Not yet," she'd told him. "V, not yet, Julian. I'll know when." A pause on his end. Then, "Okay, but just so you know, Marcus at Meridian Capital has already been briefed. The moment the word goes out, those credit lines are frozen within 48 hours. His entire operating structure depends on that line." "I know." "He doesn't know you know." "I know that too." Another pause. She could picture Julian on the other end in his office jacket off-tie loosened, that sharp mind of his running through contingencies the way other people ran through grocery lists. "You're sure about this? You're sure you want to go that route?" Victoria had taken a breath, not a trembling breath, a measured one. "Julian." He brought her to a public gala, a charity event, with our names on the invitation. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll tell Dad." That conversation had been 72 hours ago, and now here she was, stepping out of the town car in front of the Fairmont Royal York, the city's most prestigious hotel, glittering like a promise above her. Daniel's hand hovering at the small of her back in that performance of a gesture that husbands made at public events, and Victoria was thinking quietly, clearly, with absolute certainty that tonight was the night. The ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York was everything it had always been, immense and golden and overwhelming in the particular way that rooms are when they are designed specifically to remind you of your own smallness unless you belong. 600 people. Round tables draped in ivory linen, centerpieces of white orchids and soft candlelight. A raised stage at the far end where the foundation's chairman would speak later in the evening. A full bar running the length of the west wall where the serious drinkers had already positioned themselves. Victoria and Daniel moved through the room with the ease of 2 people who had done this hundreds of times. Handshakes, smiles, brief, meaningful exchanges with people who mattered. The kind of social navigation that looked effortless and required enormous invisible skill. She was 47 years old, and she was the most composed person in the room. She knew it. And she allowed herself that knowledge not as vanity, but as preparation. They had been seated for perhaps 20 minutes, drinks in hand, conversation flowing with the couple to their left, a tech investor and his wife Victoria had known for years when the energy in the room changed. She didn't see Chloe Carter enter. She felt it, not in any mystical sense, but in the way you feel a shift in barometric pressure before a storm. Something in the room adjusted itself, a collective intake of breath, too subtle to name, a slight realignment of gazes across the ballroom that happens when someone enters who was not quite expected and is impossible to ignore. Victoria turned slowly, not quickly, not with alarm, not with, Chloe Carter was 29 years old, and she was wearing a dress the color of arterial blood, and she was walking across the marble floor of the Fairmont Royal York like she owned it, which Victoria understood in an instant was precisely the point. This was not an accident of scheduling. This was not a coincidence. This was a declaration. She was beautiful. Victoria allowed that assessment without malice or pain, the way you acknowledge a fact. Chloe Carter was beautiful, dark hair, sharp features, the kind of confidence that read as charisma from across a room. She had clearly spent a great deal of time and effort constructing exactly this entrance down to the precise angle of her chin. Daniel had gone still. Victoria felt it before she saw it, the sudden, absolute tension in his body beside her. His glass, which had been halfway to his mouth, stopped moving. She did not turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on Chloe, watched the younger woman's gaze find Daniel's across the room, watched the private language that passed between them in less than 3 seconds. Then Chloe began walking toward their table. The investor's wife beside Victoria had stopped talking mid-sentence. Someone at the next table had gone quiet. The invisible audience that exists at every social gathering of this kind, the people who are always watching, always cataloging, always storing information for later use, had snapped to attention. Chloe stopped in front of Victoria's table. She extended her hand across the white linen toward Victoria with a smile that was polished and confident, and Victoria observed this with clinical precision, just slightly too wide. The smile of someone who was performing certainty rather than genuinely feeling it. "Mrs. Hayes," she said. Her voice was warm, practiced. "I don't think we've been formally introduced. I'm Chloe Carter. I've been working very closely with Daniel on the Nexus expansion project." The table went very quiet. Victoria set down her wineglass with the particular deliberateness of a woman who is choosing every movement. She looked at Chloe Carter's extended hand. She looked at Chloe Carter's face. And then she took the hand, shook it once briefly, and released it with a composure so complete that several people watching would later describe it as almost frightening. "How interesting," Victoria said. "Daniel has never mentioned you." 5 words. Quiet, polite, delivered with the kind of absolute stillness that made them land like something physical. Chloe held her smile. "Well, I imagine Daniel has many things on his plate." She glanced at Daniel, then a quick proprietary glance that she did not fully bother to disguise. "We've been working practically around the clock." "I'm sure," Victoria said, and returned her attention to the investor's wife beside her, as though Chloe Carter had become less interesting than the table centerpiece. It was a dismissal so clean and so refined that it took Chloe a full 3 seconds to understand she had been dismissed. She recovered. Of course she did. She hadn't come here to be easily dismissed. She moved to a nearby table, accepted a drink from a passing server, and settled in with the practiced composure of someone who had decided in advance that this evening was hers. And then the evening began to move in the way evenings moved when something had been ignited that couldn't be put out again. Daniel excused himself from the table twice in 40 minutes. Both times he returned with that particular expression men wore when they thought they were hiding something slightly too relaxed, slightly too deliberately casual. The second time he returned, there was a microscopic adjustment in his jacket that told her he had been standing very close to someone. She said nothing. She smiled at the right moments. She responded to conversation. She lifted her wineglass. She was to all external appearances a woman having a pleasant evening at a charity gala. Inside, she was watching a clock that no one else could see. The investor's wife, her name was Margot, and she had been a close friend of Victoria's for 11 years, leaned over slightly under the pretense of reaching for the breadbasket. Her voice was barely above a murmur. "That woman is staring at Daniel as though she's already redecorating." Victoria reached for the breadbasket herself. "I noticed." V. Margot's voice had dropped even further, touched now with something that might have been alarm. "What's happening right now?" Victoria placed a piece of bread on her plate with the same precision she placed everything. "Nothing that isn't already finished," she said quietly. Margot pulled back slightly and looked at her, the way old friends did, when they were trying to read past the surface, when they needed to know whether to be worried or reassured. Whatever she saw on Victoria's face must have been reassuring in some particular way, because she nodded once slowly and returned her attention to her husband. Across the room, Chloe Carter was laughing at something head-tilted back voice, carrying just enough positioned at a careful angle to Daniel that was intimate without being technically inappropriate. Performing. All of it performing. And Daniel, God help him, was letting it happen, more than letting it participating, leaning slightly in her direction when their eyes met, allowing the conversation to drift toward her. He had stopped being careful. Victoria recognized this with a clarity that didn't surprise her, but that still carried its own particular weight. He had decided either consciously or in the slow, reckless way that people decided things, without admitting to themselves that they were deciding that tonight was the night he stopped pretending, that the performance of their marriage had become more than he was willing to sustain. She had been watching for this. This was the thing she had been waiting for, actually, not just the affair which she had known about for nearly 4 months, but this specific moment, the moment when Daniel stopped being careful and became reckless. Because recklessness had consequences, and consequences in her family's world were things that could be precisely engineered. The dinner service came and went. The foundation chairman gave a speech about impact and generosity that was professionally executed and almost entirely sincere. Various luminaries at various tables were acknowledged. A brief video played on the large screen at the front of the room, showing footage from the programs the foundation funded, children and after-school programs, small business owners who had received micro-grants, women in leadership retreats smiling into cameras with the particular expression of people who had been told their stories mattered. Victoria watched all of it. She applauded at the right moments. She made the kind of eye contact with the chairman when he swept his gaze across the room that indicated genuine engagement. She was present. She was composed. She was also waiting. At 9:47, Daniel Hayes stood up from his chair. He didn't signal that he was going to speak. He didn't tap his glass or ask for the microphone. He simply stood, and because he was Daniel Hayes, CEO of Hayes Dynamics, because his name was on the sponsorship board, and because he occupied the particular kind of space that certain successful men occupied in rooms like this one, people looked. Then they quieted. Then they waited. He cleared his throat. He smiled that charismatic self-made man smile that had carried him into a great many rooms he would not otherwise have been able to enter. "I just want to say something," he began, and his voice carried easily across the ballroom. "Tonight is about new beginnings, about having the courage to follow your heart, even when the path isn't perfectly clear." He paused. "Let that land. About being honest with yourself and with the world, about who you really are and what you really want." Another pause. His eyes moved briefly, just briefly, but undeniably, toward Chloe Carter's table. "I think that's a lesson we could all stand to embrace." The ballroom was quiet. Not the engaged, appreciative quiet of an audience receiving a good speech. The other quiet, the held-breath quiet, of a room in which everyone has simultaneously understood something they weren't supposed to understand yet. Victoria did not move. She sat with her hands in her lap and her spine completely straight, and her expression, the expression of a woman waiting for a taxi patient, neutral, oriented toward a destination no one else could see. Daniel sat back down. He reached for his wine. His hand was almost steady. Victoria looked at him. He didn't quite meet her eyes. And then from across the ballroom, a chair scraped back. Chloe Carter stood up. She was holding her champagne glass. She was smiling, and in her eyes was something that Victoria recognized with the detached precision of someone who had spent her entire life reading rooms triumph. Premature, unearned, dangerously overconfident triumph. "I'd like to add something to that beautiful sentiment," Chloe said, her voice carrying the way she had clearly practiced it, to carry warm and bright and ringing across the candlelit tables. "To new beginnings." She raised her glass higher. "To the courage it takes to claim what you actually want. To Daniel." She let his name sit there in the middle of all that silence, like something placed very deliberately on a table for knowing his own heart. And then she turned, and she looked directly at Victoria Whitmore, and she smiled the smile of a woman who believed she had already won. "And to the future," Chloe finished, "wherever it leads." She drank. One person started to reach for their glass, then stopped, because no one else had moved. No applause, no echo of raised glasses, no validating murmur running through the crowd. 600 people in a golden ballroom, and the only sound was the ghost of Chloe Carter's voice fading into a silence that was in its totality one of the most complete and suffocating silences Victoria had ever witnessed. Margot beside Victoria had gone completely still. The investor across the table was looking at his plate. At the next table over, a woman Victoria didn't know had pressed her lips together in an expression that was both uncomfortable and riveted. Chloe's smile held for 4 full seconds. Then something crossed her face, not yet panic, not yet understanding, but a first faint tremor of doubt. The realization that the room had not responded the way she had expected it to respond. Victoria rose from her chair. Not dramatically, not quickly. She rose the way women rose in her family, with a kind of unhurried inevitability, the way tides rose because the motion was simply the next thing that was going to happen, and nothing in the world was going to alter that. She set her napkin on the table beside her plate. She smoothed the front of her gown, midnight blue silk, chosen 3 days ago for this specific evening, with a precision that it had nothing to do with fashion. And then she turned, and she began to walk toward the center of the ballroom. She was not walking away from Daniel. She was not walking toward Chloe. She was simply walking with the perfect, unhurried deliberateness of a woman who knew exactly what was about to happen because she had designed it herself. The room watched her. Every eye in the ballroom, including Chloe's, including Daniel's, including the eyes of people who had been paying attention to their dessert plates and their private conversations, followed her as she moved across the marble floor. And then from somewhere beyond the grand ballroom's double doors, Victoria Whitmore heard a sound she recognized before she heard it, the particular rhythm of footsteps, multiple and purposeful, moving in the measured way of people who had decided exactly where they were going and had no intention of being hurried. The doors opened. The first thing you noticed was the stillness, not the stillness of uncertainty, the stillness of something enormous and inevitable, arriving at a destination it had always been moving toward. Augustus Whitmore walked into the ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York Hotel, and 600 people understood in an instant, with a collective wordless certainty, that the room they were in had just changed. He was 73 years old, and he walked like he was 45, and the suit he wore cost more than most people in the room made in a month, and he carried himself with the particular gravity of a man who had spent 5 decades being the most important person in every room he entered, and had simply never developed the habit of pretending otherwise. Behind him, Eleanor Whitmore, silver-haired, elegant, with a gaze that catalogued and dismissed in a single sweep, entered with the quiet authority of a woman who had been making powerful men uncomfortable at dinner parties for 30 years and considered it a minor hobby. And beside her, Julian Whitmore, 44 years old, legal mind like a surgical instrument face, carrying that signature Whitmore expression of absolute unhurried certainty, stepped into the light of the ballroom and let his eyes move once comprehensively across the room. Daniel Hayes saw them and went the color of old chalk. Victoria, standing in the center of the ballroom, did not turn around. She didn't need to. She could see it in Daniel's face the exact moment when the full weight of what he had done and what he hadn't understood about the woman he had done it to came crashing down on him with the quiet, merciless force of something inevitable. He had thought he was leaving a wife. He had not understood that he was picking a fight with a dynasty. And dynasties in Victoria. Whitmore's family did not lose fights. They didn't have to. They simply arrived and the fight was already over. Augustus Whitmore moved through the parting crowd toward his daughter, and the room made way for him, the way water made way for stone, not because it was forced to, but because the physics of the situation left no other option. He reached Victoria. He took her hand in both of his briefly and looked at her face with the careful attention of a father reading his child's expression for things she would never say aloud. "We're here," he said quietly. "I know," she said, "right on time." Augustus Whitmore did not raise his voice. He never had to. That was the thing about men like him. The kind of authority he carried didn't need volume. It needed presence. And in that ballroom, standing 6 feet from his daughter, with 600 people watching in absolute silence, his presence was the loudest thing in the room. He looked at Daniel Hayes the way a man looked at something he had already decided to remove from a situation, not with anger, not with contempt exactly, but with the particular detached assessment of someone evaluating a problem that was already solved. Daniel, for his part, had not moved from his chair. He was sitting there with his wine glass still in his hand and his face the color of old plaster. And he looked, Victoria thought, exactly like what he was, a man who had made a very large mistake and was only now understanding the full dimensions of it. Chloe Carter was still standing. That was the thing that struck several people watching afterward, when they replayed the evening in their minds, that Chloe didn't sit down immediately. She held her position for a full, agonizing 10 seconds after the Whitmore family entered the ballroom, her champagne glass still raised at a slightly lower angle. Now her smile still technically present, but beginning to show the first hairline fractures of something she wasn't equipped to name yet. She was looking at Augustus, then at Eleanor, then at Julian, running some kind of rapid internal calculation, trying to place these people, trying to understand why the room had responded to their entrance the way it had. She didn't have enough information. That was her problem. She had done her research on Victoria Whitmore, the wife, the charity boards, the social calendar, the 12-year marriage to Daniel Hayes, the graceful, composed public presence. She had not done her research on Victoria Whitmore, the daughter, on what it meant in the specific financial and social architecture of this city to be the eldest child of Augustus Whitmore of Whitmore Capital. She was about to find out. Julian moved first. He had that quality Victoria's brother, the ability to cross a room without seeming to hurry and arrive somewhere with the feeling that he had always been there, that the room had arranged itself around him rather than the other way around. He walked to within 8 feet of Daniel's table, stopped, and clasped his hands in front of him with the easy composure of a man who argued in front of federal judges 3 times a month and had long since stopped finding any room particularly intimidating. He looked at Daniel. Daniel looked back at him. "Julian," Daniel said. His voice was careful, not panicked yet. Daniel was too controlled for immediate panic, but careful in the way that voices got careful when their owners were running very fast, internal calculations, and needed time they were not being given. "Daniel," Julian's voice was pleasant, professionally, surgically pleasant. "I hope the evening has been enjoyable so far." Something about the way he said it made the woman at the nearest table set down her fork. Daniel's jaw tightened by a fraction. "What are you doing here?" "My sister's name is on the invitation," Julian said simply. "As is yours. We're here to support the foundation." He let a half-second of silence land. "And to support Victoria, of course, as we always do." That last sentence was not a statement. Everyone in earshot understood that it was not a statement. It was a perimeter being drawn quietly and precisely around a woman who some people in this room had apparently underestimated, in full view of everyone who would ever matter to them, professionally or socially. Daniel set his wine glass down. "Julian, this isn't the place." "I agree entirely," Julian said, "which is why I'm going to suggest we take care of certain matters quietly and quickly so that the Foundation's evening can proceed without further interruption." He glanced once, just once, toward Chloe Carter, who was finally sitting back down her champagne glass, lowering to the table in front of her with a small click that sounded in the surrounding silence much louder than it was. Then Julian looked back at Daniel. "My father would like a word." It wasn't a request. The grammar of it might have been a request, but the meaning was not. Everyone understood that the meaning was not. Augustus Whitmore moved to stand beside his son. He was unhurried. He had been unhurried his entire life. Men who built the kind of thing he had built learned early that urgency was a signal of weakness, that real power moved at its own pace, because it could afford to, because time itself tended to cooperate with it. He looked at Daniel Hayes, and Daniel looked back at him, and for a moment the entire ballroom existed only in the space between those two men. "Daniel," Augustus said. "Just the name. Nothing attached to it. Just the name and the voice of a man who had once personally approved the first significant line of credit that had made Hayes Dynamics possible 12 years ago as a wedding gift to his daughter and her ambitious new husband." Daniel's throat moved. "Sir, I think," Augustus said, "that you and I have some things to discuss. Not tonight. Tonight is for the Foundation." He let his eyes move briefly, comprehensively across the table, across Chloe's empty seat, across the disrupted evening, across everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes, and then he looked back at Daniel with an expression that was almost kind in the way that a final diagnosis delivered by a precise doctor was almost kind. But soon, he stepped back, and that was it. That was all. No raised voices, No accusations, no dramatic confrontation. And somehow it was the most devastating thing that had happened in that ballroom all evening. At the table, 3 rows to the left, a hedge fund manager named Richard Pratt, who had done business with Hayes Dynamics for 7 years and who had been watching the entire sequence of events with the riveted attention of a man watching a market move, leaned over to his wife and murmured 3 words, "Call Marcus tomorrow." His wife knew what that meant. His wife had been married to a man in finance for 31 years. She nodded without looking at him. At another table, a woman who sat on 2 of the same foundation boards as Victoria quietly pulled out her phone and sent a text message to a colleague that read simply, "Did you see that?" The reply came back in under 30 seconds. "I saw it." These were the small, invisible movements that would begin to gather and accelerate in the days to come. But right now in the ballroom, the immediate drama was still unfolding, and it was unfolding in the direction of Chloe Carter. Eleanor Whitmore had not spoken yet. She had entered the room, positioned herself, and observed with the unruffled patience of a woman who had spent 50 years watching rooms and knew exactly when to move and when to wait. Now she moved. She walked unhurried past her husband and her son, past Daniel's table, and stopped at the table where Chloe Carter sat. Chloe looked up. In her eyes, Victoria could see, even from where she was standing, the specific expression of someone who understood finally that something had gone badly, badly wrong with an evening they had very carefully planned, but who had not yet fully mapped the extent of the damage. Eleanor looked at Chloe the way she looked at everything completely without flinching and without particular malice. Just clarity. Just the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had known exactly who she was for so long that she no longer required the validation of anyone else's opinion. "I don't believe we've met," Eleanor said. Her voice was even. It carried. Chloe opened her mouth. I know who you are," Eleanor said, and the mild, quiet certainty of it stopped Chloe mid-sentence, the way a hand raised in a crosswalk stopped traffic. "I also know what you thought you were doing tonight." A pause. Not a long one. Not a theatrical one. Just long enough. "You mistook borrowed attention for power, my dear. It's a common error, but the consequences of it—" Eleanor let her gaze move briefly to the room around them, to the 600 people who were observing with the intensity of people watching something they would be describing to others for years, are rarely comfortable. She turned away from Chloe with the same unhurried ease with which she had turned toward her and walked back to her husband's side. And that was the entirety of Eleanor Whitmore's engagement with the woman who had stood up in a ballroom and toasted the destruction of her daughter's marriage. It was, several people would say later, the most effective thing anyone had said all evening, including the foundation chairman's professionally written speech. Chloe Carter sat very still at her table. The woman beside her, a colleague from Hayes Dynamics who had come tonight as part of the corporate block and who was deeply, visibly regretting it had moved her chair approximately 4 inches to the left, a tiny but unmistakable act of social distance. Chloe reached for her champagne glass. It was empty. She set it back down. Daniel had not looked at her since the Whitmore family entered the room. He was looking at Augustus, then at Julian, then at his own hands. He was performing some kind of internal triage. Victoria could see it, the rapid, urgent assessment of a man trying to understand how much damage had been done and whether any of it was reversible. His expression was the expression of someone arriving at answers they did not want. Victoria watched him from where she stood in the center of the room. She watched the understanding move across his face in real time, like watching weather change over water. She watched him understand about the credit lines, or begin to understand because he didn't know the specifics yet, didn't know about Marcus at Meridian Capital, or what Julian's 3 days of preparation had produced, but he was smart enough to feel the shape of it, to understand that the financial architecture of his company was suddenly fundamentally less secure than it had been 2 hours ago. She watched him understand about the investors, about the board members sitting at various tables in this very room who had just watched Augustus Whitmore enter a gala and make a point of standing near Daniel Hayes without extending any warmth toward him. In a world where relationships were currency, the Whitmore family had just publicly withdrawn their investment, and every sophisticated person in the room had clocked it and filed it for immediate use. She watched Daniel Hayes understand in real time that he had confused the wife with the power, that he had looked at Victoria for 12 years and seen a woman composed, elegant, present, and had not seen the dynasty behind her because the dynasty had not needed to make itself visible until now. Margot appeared at Victoria's side. She didn't say anything immediately. She simply stood there for a moment, the way close friends did when they understood that the moment didn't require words yet. Then quietly, "Are you all right?" Victoria considered the question with genuine attention, the way she considered everything. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was Margot, "It's strange. I thought I would feel more." "What do you feel?" Victoria looked at Daniel across the room. He was looking back at her now, finally actually looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in years. Not love, not guilt exactly. Something more complicated than either. The look of a man seeing something clearly that he had been choosing not to see for a long time, and finding that the clarity arriving this late and under these circumstances provided no relief whatsoever. "Finished," she said simply. "I feel finished." Margot absorbed this. Then she took Victoria's arm lightly, the way women who had been friends for over a decade took each other's arms. "Then let's go be finished somewhere with better dessert." Victoria almost smiled. Almost. "Give me a moment." She walked to her father. Augustus saw her coming and turned fully toward her, giving her his complete attention in the way he always had, not the divided attention of a busy man making space, but the whole focused, unhurried attention that had always made Victoria feel since childhood that she was the most important thing in whatever room they shared. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We were always going to come," he said. "You know that." "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a full conversation happening in that silence that no one else in the room had access to about choices and timing and the particular kind of courage it took to wait until you were certain rather than moving when the pain was freshest. "I wanted to wait until he made it public." Augustus nodded. "You were right to wait. Julian has everything in place. Everything." A pause. "The Meridian line freezes at 9 tomorrow morning, unless Marcus hears from me to the contrary." His eyes moved briefly to Daniel across the room. "He will not hear from me to the contrary." Victoria took a breath. "Okay." The board review trigger activates Wednesday. The contract clauses Julian flagged. Augustus stopped himself, looked at his daughter's face. "We can go through the specifics tomorrow. Tonight is done." "Tonight is done," she agreed. She turned back once to look at the room. At Daniel sitting at the table that still had her place setting across from his, staring at a half-full wine glass, as though it contained information he needed. At Chloe Carter, who had stopped performing entirely now, who was sitting in her red dress with her arms close to her body and her face arranged in the careful blankness of someone trying very hard not to look like they were calculating an exit. At the room full of people who would take what they had witnessed tonight and carry it out into the world of meetings and calls and quiet conversations that constituted the real architecture of power in a city like this one. She looked at all of it. She let herself feel it, not with triumph, not with grief, but with the particular clarity that came after a long and difficult decision had finally been made and enacted and could not be unmade. Then she turned away. She walked toward her family, her father and her mother and her brother, who were already moving toward the exit, with the unhurried certainty of people who had done what they came to do, and she did not look back again. Behind her, she heard a chair scrape. She heard Daniel's voice say her name, Victoria, in a tone she hadn't heard him use since the early years of their marriage, when things were real between them. Low, uncertain, almost young. She kept walking. She heard it again. "Victoria, please." She did not stop, not because she was punishing him, not because she was performing an exit, but because there was genuinely nothing left to say, and she had understood that for a long time before tonight, and tonight had simply made it official. Julian held the door for her. As she passed him, he said nothing. He simply looked at her with the expression that meant he was proud of her, and that they would talk tomorrow, and that everything was already moving. She stepped out of the ballroom. The noise of the room, the hum of conversation reasserting itself, now that the main drama had concluded the clink of glasses, the tentative resumption of a normal evening that could not quite manage to feel normal, faded behind the closing door. Eleanor fell into step beside her daughter as they moved through the corridor. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Their heels made quiet sounds on the floor. Somewhere behind them, they could hear Augustus and Julian talking in the low, efficient shorthand of men who had already moved into the operational phase of something. "How long did you know?" Eleanor asked finally. 4 months, Victoria said. Eleanor absorbed this. "You said nothing." "I was waiting." For what specifically? Victoria thought about it. About the night she'd first noticed the phone going face down. About the 112 mornings she had made coffee and watched Daniel move through their kitchen with the particular distraction of a man carrying a secret he was growing less careful about. About the call with Julian, about the guest list for tonight's gala with Chloe Carter's name on the Hayes Dynamics corporate block. "I was waiting for him to make a choice," she said. "A real one, out loud, in front of people who mattered." She paused. "So there would be no ambiguity. Not for him, not for me, not for anyone." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precise, understated delivery that was her signature, "He certainly managed that." And Victoria in the corridor outside the ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York, away from the 600 people and the orchids and the candlelight and the wreckage of an evening that had played out exactly as she had known it would, laughed. Briefly and genuinely, the way she hadn't laughed in a very long time. Eleanor took her arm. They walked. Back inside the ballroom, Daniel Hayes sat at a table that felt very large and very empty. His phone was in his hand. He was looking at it without seeing it. Around him, the evening carried on conversation dessert service, the quiet professional movements of the waitstaff with the determined normalcy of a social world that had witnessed something significant and was now collectively processing it. At her table, Chloe Carter straightened her spine. She reached for a glass of water since the champagne was gone. She arranged her expression into something that was meant to communicate that she was completely fine, entirely unbothered, and in full command of herself and the situation. The woman beside her, the Hayes Dynamics colleague, who had been gradually migrating her chair to the left all evening, excused herself to visit the restroom. She did not come back. Chloe sat alone in her red dress in a room full of people and looked at the ballroom doors that the Whitmore family had walked through, and for the first time since she had entered this room tonight, in the carefully calculated confidence of a woman who believed she was winning, she allowed herself to feel the first cold edge of what was actually happening. She had not won tonight. She had not even competed in the game she thought she was playing. She had walked into a situation she had fundamentally misread, and she had made herself the most visible person in the room at exactly the wrong moment, and 600 people had watched her do it. Her champagne toast echoed in her own memory, the raised glass, the smile, the confident, to the future wherever it leads, and now in the silence of understanding what she had actually done, it felt less like a triumph, and more like a declaration she would spend a very long time trying to outlive. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York continued its evening. The foundation's work went on. The conversations continued. The dessert plates were cleared. The orchestra in the corner played something gentle and complicated. And in the middle of all of it, a story that had been building for 112 days reached its first ending. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, not the kind that looked from the outside like a victory celebration. Just a door swinging closed. A woman walking out of a room she had once belonged to into the open air of a life she was about to rebuild entirely on her own terms. The kind of ending that was also unmistakably the beginning of something else. The morning after the gala, Daniel Hayes woke up alone, not in the sense that Chloe wasn't there, she wasn't. But that wasn't what he meant when the word alone hit him at 6:47 in the morning with the particular weight of something irreversible. He woke up alone in the way that a man woke up alone when he understood, without anyone having to say it, that the life he had been living for 12 years had ended the previous evening, and he had been the one who ended it. He lay there for 3 minutes without moving. Then he reached for his phone. 17 missed calls, 4 from board members, 2 from his CFO, Marcus No Wait, not his CFO, Marcus at Meridian Capital. The name hit him like cold water. He sat up. He called Marcus back. Marcus picked up on the second ring. His voice was professional and careful in the way that voices got when they were delivering information the speaker did not enjoy delivering. "Daniel, I've been trying to reach you. I see that. What's happening? A pause. Not a long one. Long enough. I received a communication this morning regarding the Whitmore Capital position on your credit facility. Another pause. The line has been frozen, Daniel, effective 9 a.m. today. Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. Frozen. Pending a full review. I want to be honest with you. I'm not in a position to say when or whether. Who authorized this? Marcus's pause this time was different, more careful. The instruction came directly from Augustus Whitmore's office. Daniel got out of bed. He walked to the window. The city was already moving below him, entirely indifferent to the fact that his operating structure had just lost one of its 3 primary supports at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. How much runway do we have without the Meridian line at current burn rate? Marcus hesitated. 11 weeks, maybe 12 if we defer the Vancouver expansion. 11 weeks. Daniel stood at his window and looked at the city and thought about 11 weeks and what 11 weeks meant when you were trying to hold together a company whose foundation had just become overnight a great deal less stable than it had appeared. He called Julian Whitmore. Julian picked up immediately, which was somehow worse than if he hadn't picked up at all. Daniel, you froze my credit line. My father froze your credit line, Julian said with the precise accuracy of a man who did not make errors of attribution. That's an important distinction. Julian. Daniel's voice was controlled. He was working very hard to keep it controlled. Whatever happened last night, whatever you all think happened, this is not the way to handle it. This affects 300 employees, people's jobs, people's... Daniel. Julian's voice didn't change. It stayed exactly as pleasant and exactly as immovable as it had been in the ballroom the previous evening. I'm going to stop you right there because I want to be very clear about something. The Meridian Credit Facility was always contingent on Whitmore Capital's continued participation in your investor structure. That's in the original agreement. You signed that agreement. I drafted it. A pause. This isn't a reaction to last night. This is a contractual consequence of a decision you made when you decided to restructure your priorities. The word priorities landed with the precision of something thrown very accurately. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then, I need to speak to Victoria. Victoria will speak to you through our family's legal representation, Julian said. As of this morning, I am that representation. You're welcome to call my office and schedule... Daniel hung up. He stood in the middle of his bedroom with his phone in his hand, and his heart hammering, and his mind running through numbers, through timelines, through the interlocking dependencies of a company he had spent 15 years building, and he tried to find the angle, the move, the counter, the thing a smart man did when a situation like this one arrived. He couldn't find it. For the first time in 15 years, he genuinely couldn't find it. Because the thing about the Whitmore family's financial architecture, and this was the thing Daniel had understood intellectually for years, but had never truly felt in his body until this morning, was that it wasn't just money. It was relationships. It was the network of trust and credibility and professional association that Augustus Whitmore had spent 50 years building, and into which Daniel Hayes had been absorbed when he married Victoria, and from which he was now quite systematically being removed. His CFO called at 9:15, then his head of investor relations at 9:32. Then at 9:47, Richard Pratt, the hedge fund manager from the Gala, the man who had watched Augustus Whitmore enter the ballroom and called his wife a word called, and left a voicemail that was professionally worded and deeply unmistakably clear in its meaning. Pratt Capital was requesting a review of its Hayes Dynamics position. They would be in touch. Daniel listened to the voicemail twice. Then he sat down on the edge of his bed. This man who had stood up in a ballroom the previous evening and given a speech about courage and new beginnings and put his face in his hands. Across the city in this Whitmore family's principal residence, Victoria was having breakfast with her parents and her brother at 8 in the morning. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that families who had been through significant things together knew how to maintain, not the uncomfortable quiet of people who didn't know what to say, but the settled quiet of people who had said what needed to be said and were now simply being together. Eleanor had made coffee, Augustus was reading something on his tablet with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Julian had his laptop open and was moving through emails with the focused efficiency of a man for whom 9 a.m. on a Tuesday was a deeply operational hour. Victoria was eating toast and looking out the window at the city thinking. She had slept, which surprised her slightly. She had expected to lie awake with the particular restless energy of aftermath, the way you sometimes couldn't sleep after a significant thing, when your mind kept returning to the evening and replaying it, looking for the moments you might have handled differently. But she had slept, solidly, in the way of someone whose body understood that a long tension had finally released. Julian looked up from his laptop. Meridian confirmed, 9 a.m. exactly as planned. Augustus nodded without looking up from his tablet. Victoria wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. And the board review? Wednesday. I've already contacted 3 of the 5 independent board members directly. Julian's eyes moved back to his screen. Let's just say the gala made certain conversations significantly easier to have. Meaning that when a CEO gives an unscripted public speech at a charity event about following his heart and new beginnings. Julian paused to click something. The board members of his company tend to have some questions about his judgment, professionally speaking. Victoria absorbed this. And the Vancouver expansion. Frozen pending the credit review, which means his Q3 projections are no longer realistic, which means his conversations with the 2 institutional investors he's been courting. Julian made a small, precise gesture with one hand that communicated the conclusion without requiring the sentence to be finished. Augustus finally looked up from his tablet. He looked at his daughter with the careful, unhurried attention he always gave her. How are you feeling this morning? The question was so direct and so genuine that it cut through everything else, through the legal mechanics and the financial timelines and the operational specifics, and landed somewhere much simpler. Victoria looked at her father. I feel like someone who's been holding their breath for 4 months, she said, and finally exhaled. Augustus nodded. He looked at her for another moment. Then he went back to his tablet, which was coming from him as close to "I'm proud of you" as the man typically got in spoken form. Eleanor, who was refilling her coffee, said without turning around, "The foundation called this morning. They want to know if last night's events require any kind of statement." "No," Victoria said immediately. "That's what I told them." Eleanor brought her coffee back to the table. "I also told them that the Whitmore Foundation's donation this year would be increasing by 30%, and that Victoria would be joining their leadership committee." She sat down. That seemed to satisfy any remaining concerns. Victoria looked at her mother. "You did that without asking me." Eleanor met her daughter's eyes with the serene certainty of a woman who had spent 50 years being right about the important things. "Did I need to ask?" Victoria held her gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee. "No," she said, "you didn't." At 10:15 that morning, Chloe Carter arrived at the Hayes Dynamics offices on the 34th floor of a downtown tower and found that her keycard no longer worked. She stood at the glass security door for a full 15 seconds, pressing it twice, then a third time before the reality of what was happening became undeniable. She turned to the security desk. The guard on duty, a man named Frank, who had worked the building for 6 years and who had always been perfectly pleasant to her, looked at her with an expression of genuine discomfort. "Miss Carter, I was told to let you know that HR would like to speak with you. They asked that you wait in the lobby." "My keycard isn't working," she said. Her voice was steady. She was holding her voice very steady. "Yes, ma'am. If you'd like to wait." "Frank?" She took a breath. "Can you just call upstairs and let them know I'm here? There's clearly some kind of system error with my Miss Carter." His voice was kind, but immovable. "HR has asked you to wait in the lobby. I'd recommend waiting in the lobby." She waited in the lobby for 22 minutes. The HR director, a woman named Sandra, who Chloe had always found efficient and forgettable, came down in the elevator with a manila envelope and the expression of someone who had done this before and found it uncomfortable every time. "Chloe," Sandra said, "thank you for coming in." "My keycard doesn't work," Chloe said again, because somehow this felt like the most manageable piece of what was happening. "I know, I'm sorry." Sandra extended the envelope. This outlines your severance package and the terms of your separation. We've been generous, given the circumstances more generous than was strictly required. Chloe looked at the envelope. She did not take it immediately. Given what circumstances? Sandra pressed her lips together briefly. Chloe, I think you know. I want to hear you say it. Sandra held her gaze. Your conduct last night at the Foundation Gala was considered a significant breach of professional standards. Beyond that, she paused, there have been concerns raised at the board level about certain conduct over the past several months. Combine these circumstances. Concerns raised by whom? Chloe's voice was sharper now. The control was beginning to cost her more than she had. By Victoria Whitmore, because she has her family come in and throw their weight around and suddenly everyone's, Chloe! Sandra's voice didn't rise, didn't harden. It just became very, very clear. The concerns were raised by multiple members of the board. This decision was made at that level. I'm simply here to facilitate the process as professionally as possible. She extended the envelope again. Please take this. Read it carefully. And if you have questions, you can contact our legal department directly. Chloe took the envelope. Her hand was steady. Her face was steady. Everything about her external presentation was steady, in the way that things were steady right before they weren't. She walked out of the Hayes Dynamics lobby into the sharp morning air and stood on the sidewalk with a manila envelope in her hand and the city moving around her in every direction, and she thought about last night, about the red dress, about the raised champagne glass, about the moment when she had looked straight at Victoria Whitmore and said to the future, wherever it leads. The future had arrived considerably faster than she had anticipated. She thought about calling Daniel. She had not spoken to him since the gala. He had not called, had not texted, and she had told herself last night, lying awake in her apartment, replaying the evening in brutal detail, that he was probably managing the fallout, that he would call in the morning, that whatever the complications were, they were temporary complications in the trajectory of something that was fundamentally real. She called him. It went to voicemail after 4 rings. She didn't leave a message. She called again 20 minutes later, standing at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the building she could no longer enter. This time it went to voicemail after 2 rings, which meant he had seen her name and declined it. She put her phone in her bag. She ordered a coffee she didn't drink. And she sat with the specific, clarifying silence of a woman who was beginning to understand, in concrete and unavoidable terms, what had actually happened in that ballroom and what it meant for every part of her life that had been without her fully realizing it, contingent on a situation she had fundamentally misread. Daniel Hayes, meanwhile, was on his 4th call of the morning when his assistant knocked on his office door and entered without waiting, which told him immediately that whatever she was about to say required the kind of urgency that overrode normal protocol. "You need to see this," she said, and held out her phone. On the screen was a social media post from an account associated with one of the city's more influential society bloggers, the kind of person who attended the right events and had the right contacts and had spent years cultivating an audience that was in the specific way of their world. Exactly the audience whose opinion shaped professional reputations in tangible ways. The post had gone up at 9 a.m. It had been shared 214 times by 10:15. It described in the specific and carefully sourced way of someone who had been in the room the events of the previous evening. The unscripted speech, the champagne toast, the arrival of the Whitmore family. It used phrases like stunning public confrontation and the quiet power of old money and what Hayes Dynamics executives might want to know about their CEO's priorities. It was by any measure exceptionally damaging, and it had been shared 214 times in 75 minutes. Daniel handed the phone back to his assistant. "Get me our PR firm." "They've already called," she said. "Twice. They say," she glanced down at her own phone, "they say they need to speak with you urgently about the narrative." The narrative. He almost laughed. There was no narrative. There was just what had happened in front of 600 people, and what was continuing to happen in the form of frozen credit lines and board-level concerns and a social media post being shared 214 times and counting. He picked up his desk phone and called